Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Thanks everyone for being here. This is a special kind of viewing party because our speaker is actually not here, but some of us are in Wright Auditorium. A bunch of us are on WebEx. So thanks everyone for being here. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Thomas Doherty, who is a clinical and environmental psychologist based in Portland, Oregon. He has a specialty addressing people's concerns about environmental issues and climate change. His publications include the groundbreaking paper, The Psychological Impacts of Global Climate Change. Thomas is a fellow of the APA and founded one of the first environmentally focused training programs for mental health counselors in the U.S. at Lewis and Clark Graduate School. He also co-hosts the Climate Change and Happiness podcast, which we should all download. You can learn more about him and his trainings for mental health professionals at his website, which is www.selfsustain.com. I will be quiet and mute myself now, and I will turn things over to Dr. Doherty. Thanks so much.
Well, I want to thank McKenna Parnes and Emily Rice and Molly Groh and everyone for inviting me today. And we're going to kind of jump into this. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, where I live. And I lived in Seattle for a number of years, and I have a lot of personal connections in Seattle. So it's nice to be chatting with you today. We're going to be talking about climate change and mental health and healthcare, and this idea of personal sustainability, which is simply bringing your sustainability concepts and principles and values to bear in your life. That's what personal sustainability is. And yes, as noted, there's a podcast that I'm involved in with a colleague from Finland, where if you're interested in this material, that's what we talk about. We're all climate, all emotions, all the time, and we talk about therapy, we talk about life, and something you might be interested in. And then I want to give a shout out to the CARE Committee, the Climate Change CARE Committee. There's a code for you as well. And I'll make sure that these slides can be shared after my talk. But if you want to join with like-minded colleagues, isolation is one of the biggest factors and dangers in eco-anxiety, being alone with your thoughts and feelings. So really, it's important to work with people, be together with people. And let's jump in. I'm going to start. I know it's a bit corny to start with a cartoon in presentations, but I'm going to break that rule today and talk about this cartoon which I like. I like it because it can be read on a number of levels. You've got this person who looks busy and harried, maybe coming home after a long work day, and they're being approached by someone wanting to talk about a really wicked problem that's eluded humanity since the dawn of civilization. So it's an absurdity, it's a cartoon, it's a dark humor about the world, but it does speak to our challenges, right? We have 45 to 50 minutes to talk about really big issues that are difficult and complicated. And there's part of us that doesn't want to take these things on, and we're busy and we have a lot of other things to do. And when you're walking down the hall in the medical center there, you've got a lot on your mind already to add one more thing. So it is a challenge. So we want to think about our mindset and our poise, because really, when we're our best selves, we do want to think about things like this. We do want to take on big problems. We do want to grapple with problems that have eluded humanity. That's why we go to medical school. That's why we learn. That's why we come together. So we want to try to capture a mindset where we can take these on. And it's not easy, and we won't get to everything today. It's impossible. And there's a lot of levels to this cartoon. These characters are both white. They look relatively privileged. There's an implication that they have a choice about whether to take these kinds of issues on, or maybe they can let them pass by. So not everyone has a choice with these things. That's important to recognize. The young man with the clipboard seems idealistic, maybe naive, but it's hard to know. The woman character who's walking home probably has family and children and many other things. So there's a lot under here. So there's a lot of humanity hidden in this cartoon. So let's keep moving in that direction. The cartoon brings up just some general ground rules for talking about environmental issues, climate change. We have to think ecologically in the sense that these are all systemic issues. When you pick on one thing in the universe, you find it hitched to everything else. Classic saying from John Muir. So when I talk about mental health or climate change or healthcare, doesn't mean that you'll be thinking about the same thing. You might be thinking about another part of that issue. And when we do bring these topics up, they're emotional. They're not just intellectual. People have strong emotions and values and dreams bound up in this, and they want to tell their stories. So if you do an open group, we have more time, people will want to tell their stories. That comes with the territory. And we have to acknowledge racism, injustice. All environmental issues are social justice issues. The least powerful, least privileged, the most marginalized people are the ones that bear the brunt of all kinds of these issues, these broader climate issues that we're talking about, and environmental issues. And we have to work on owning our own footprint, our own climate impacts. So it's not just helping others, it's also thinking about how our actions, either individually or collectively, contribute to climate change. And that's a really difficult topic too, because we're hostages in many ways, trapped in an unsustainable system that forces us to be complicit in, climate destroying behaviors. That's just the reality of the situation. So we want to kind of own that without lapsing into despair, and think about how we can make change as best we can. And accepting diversity, it's related to the ecological point, right? There's a lot of ways that people come into this topic, and I use this image of the climate elephant. You've probably seen this blind man and elephant parable used in many ways. I know it's used in healthcare in different ways, but it's important to recognize we cannot see all aspects of something like climate change. It's too big. It's too big of an issue. We see our parts of it. When I'm talking to a larger group in the public, if I say seeing the elephant, it could be any number of things. It could be any of these phrases or words on this slide. Those are all part of it. Now in healthcare, we have a whole nother set of phrases and a set of concepts. You've got the operations of the hospital and the institution. You've got the governance. You've got the business. You've got the actual delivery of healthcare, right? But these are all part of it. And so part of the poise that comes with this work is scale and time and space, and realizing, well, what are we working on now in this moment, and being aware of that, and using our communication skills to figure that out, knowing that they are linked systemically. So when we make progress on one area, often it will help others. So just something to keep in mind as we go. I'm going to jump right into some research that I did on climate change and mental health in the past that's still very relevant. So this is a difficult topic, so I want to kind of keep in mind that we're going to have some poise for this, and I'm going to give you some mental maps that might be helpful. And this is an undoctored, photo of a sky, when we have a wildfire. And you all know, I think in the Northwest and Seattle, you've experienced this as well. We know what it's like when these disasters come close to home. So years ago, when I started working on climate change and mental health, it's like the before time. It was before climate change was really a big issue and really on everyone's radar screen. One of the challenges was trying to figure out how to put all this together in a mental health framework and a psychological impacts framework. And I want to just guide you through the framework that I worked on years ago, which some of the terms have changed, but the model is actually quite useful today. And so just walking you through some of this classic research. The first distinction is between climate and weather. Climate is an abstraction. We cannot touch the climate. It's a set of ideas. It's a set of measurements. But we can touch the weather, and the kind of historic accord between climate and weather has been broken, right? With the change from the Holocene to what they call the Anthropocene. Like, our weather is not what we're used to, and the climate is changing, and the systems are changing, right? And that's just descriptively causing much change and disruption around the world. Where we're concerned about this, of course, is in this idea of disasters and mental health impacts. And you can think of if you want to simplify this, you can think of three basic baskets of impacts. You've got the obvious disaster impacts, which can understand. It's easy to see: a severe storm, wildfire, flooding, heat event, and all the kind of injuries and traumas that will flow from those. Then you've got the broad ripple effects, the broad psychosocial societal impacts of these events. If you imagine a pond with a raindrop falling on it, and then you have several raindrops, and you have hundreds of raindrops, and all those raindrops create ripples around them, and then the ripples all kind of flow together. That's what it's like when you think about society and these issues, right? So we've got both the chronic repair and rebuilding and healing after an actual disaster, and then you've got social factors like violence and conflict, and you've got migrants and refugees, and you've got the knowledge of injustice and kind of depletion of ecosystems and things. And those are things that go over time. And then the third basket is the indirect impacts, the emotional impacts, the vicarious impacts. That was seen as speculative, 15 years ago. Maybe that will happen. Yeah, that makes sense, that people will have emotional and psychological impacts even from afar, watching things from afar. And we know that's true. That's been proven in various kinds of research around various events. Unfortunately, after the 9/11 bombing, there was some really good research showing that we can have trauma and PTSD just by observing terrible events from a distance. What's changed now is that these baskets are all closer together. So it's not so far away. Climate change is not something that's happening in Greenland or on a Pacific island. It's happening right here. And that's what's really driven people into therapy and driven the concerns in society. But the other pieces here, we've got how we see these things. People view these issues through different kinds of lenses, through their belief systems, through their education. So not even in the same place, in the same town, same event, people are going to think about it differently. That's the beauty of humanity, and also the challenge. And then, of course, we have practically the moderators, the risk factors, and sources of resilience. So even in the same town, the same event, people are going to be affected differently, whether they have home insurance, whether they have a way to escape, whether they have social supports and things like that. So that leads us down the road a little bit here into what to do about this. One of the things I've done with clients is have them create their own kind of IPCC report. So it's not the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's your individual problems with climate change. And what does that look like? So you can think about this yourself as an individual, because this is not separate, of course, from our own lives. So some questions to ask. And like any kind of healthcare work, you've got to do your own work before you can help other people. So what is your understanding of climate and weather? This is obviously going to be evolving. It's a complicated area, but there's some practicalities about what's happening in the region where you live. What impacts have you personally experienced? Do you consider yourself having experienced a disaster, or the ripple effects, or the emotional effects, or some combination? What are your risk factors and your protective factors? You could have this conversation from the perspective of a whole hospital system. And how do you understand the impacts? Like, what's the information you have? What are your lenses and filters? Sometimes I use that term. A lens is something that helps you to see something clearly. A filter is something that kind of blocks your vision, right? So when I see one part of the climate elephant, I see that part clearly, but it also sometimes stops me from seeing other parts. So even organizationally, I might understand my area, but not the other person's area. So that's kind of an insight. The fourth question is more of an insight, growth, and learning question. And people have different patterns with these impacts, right? Some people have been directly experienced disasters of various kinds, and then the chronic rebuilding and ripple effects, but they're resilient grievers, and they move forward, rebuild, and they don't necessarily take it emotionally. Other people might not have experienced a direct disaster, but they're dealing with indirect issues. Maybe they own a business, for example, that's very related to the climate and climatic conditions, like being a fisherman or owning a winery or some other kind of thing, owning a ski area, just thinking business wise. And then you've got a group of people that haven't personally experienced disasters. They're lucky, they're privileged, they're buffered. They live in a relatively benign place, but they're experiencing the emotional impacts, right? And so there's just different patterns. But again, how do you understand? How do you understand climate and weather? What impacts? What are your risk factors? These are some practical questions to think about, just broadly. So if we also keep going broadly, big picture, public health level thinking, when we're thinking about serving the public, serving our patients, serving our clients, so there's a spectrum of coping, right? As you know, from optimal well-being and resilience to illness, psychopathology. And there's a spectrum of coping and functioning with climate and environmental issues. There is the potential for what is optimal, even in the situation. And, we have a range of ways to help people and help ourselves. Self-help, education, therapeutic programs, direct therapy and healthcare. And then, the goal is to keep people moving toward health. We want to help people to be adapting, to feel a sense of possibility, to retain and reclaim a sense of the future, and to learn and to grow, and to, especially with young people, we want to give them a life. We want them to have a life and a sense of possibility and future and loving the world and things like that. So we want to keep moving toward health, and hopefully catch issues at an adjustment level when people are able to move toward health on their own power as much as possible. And then, of course, we've got all the whole rest of the population and comorbidity and different multiple occurring issues. So there's a lot in a healthcare system to think about, but you will find your place in the spectrum, or multiple places in the spectrum. And just keeping in mind, this is not simple. It's also polarized, it's politicized in various ways. So unfortunately, we've got a lot of polluted language in our society about climate change and things like that. So it isn't just an objective conversation. So something to think about as we go forward. We can use a framework of development to think about impacts and issues for eco-distress broadly. What I say eco-distress could be anxiety, depression, concern. Children obviously have their own developmental perspectives and places, and so we have normal child development and normal anxieties and things that kids could have. Some kids are precocious learners. They learn things that they're not necessarily ready to take in. They might have negative experiences, disaster experiences, and of course each child is different, even in a family. We've got adolescents. Again, these are potential vulnerabilities. Adolescents obviously have a lot on their plate. Being a student, they might be developing really idealistic thoughts. High functioning young people might be taking on a lot. They've got all kinds of other identity and developmental stressors going on. You've got young adults in their 20s, maybe immersed in activism or forming their new identity or separating from family, experimenting with different ways of thinking about what I would call their environmental identity, their sense of self in relation to nature and the natural world. And your environmental identity intersects with other aspects of your identity, gender identity, sexual identity, cultural identity. And then parents, new or prospective parents, not only thinking about their own well-being, but well-being of children, or questions about bringing children into the world. And then the obvious challenges that come from being a parent, being a new parent. And then you've got just broadly people in their lives and careers, particularly environmental professionals who could really be struggling with work-life balance and various things. And then you've got elders who have their own challenges here, particularly if they've been long-term environmental people. Like, how do they make sense of their life and whether they feel relatively successful or not? Classic sort of developmental thinking of an elder outside of their own health and mortality concerns in family. So that's one way to think about a broad range of impacts and experiences. And then there's just common issues that come in this territory. Obviously, we do have disaster victims and trauma survivors of various kinds. We also have people that are just having some consciousness raising about a climate change or another environmental issue. They, in the ecotherapy world, they call that a waking up syndrome. And so suddenly you see everything differently. You see a system or a pattern you weren't aware of before. And that could be really, like an earthquake in someone's life, to think about things like that. And then we have our own, as I say, issues and issues. So I might have my capital I issues about the state of the world and what I want to achieve and my goals, but I also have my own personal mental health issues, my own temperament, my own pre-existing vulnerability to anxiety or depression. So we've got all our pre-existing stuff. And then again, the parents, grandparents, workers, people working outdoors in heat. We've got a lot of potential places where eco distress will come in, environmentalists, conservation professionals that really see the problems closely. So a number of different ways people come into the eco distress territory. Some basics on diagnosis. People often ask, Dr. Doherty, is eco-anxiety a diagnosis? Well, no, it's not a diagnosis officially in the diagnostic manual, but anxiety is, and there's a number of different kinds of anxiety. So that's where the conversation goes. How do we use what we already know? If someone has it's normal to be anxious about climate change. That's not a disorder. It would be weird for someone not to be anxious about climate change given the circumstances. And if people are doing the best and working at this and having minimal interference in their functioning, there's no diagnosis there. That's just life. But you can consider and using the person as a guide, if people have different thoughts about adjustment disorder, I think it's useful in a climate and eco sense because it is clearly an adjustment to a stressor, a clear stressor, heat, smoke, things like that. So we're all going to be having some adjustment disorder symptoms during a severe heat event. When the heat's up to 110, 120, which can happen, it's going to cause physical and mental problems for the most healthiest person. And then, of course, if there's evidence of diagnostic issues and significant impairment, then that's diagnosable. Now, again, we don't want to politicize things, and we have to be careful. This is all fraught with different ideological levels of stress. Eco-anxiety as an issue is both a social issue and kind of a label and an identity. It means that I care about nature. I have anxiety. So yes. And so eco-anxiety has a sort of a personal side, a private side, and a public side. And we have to think about that as we think about any kind of cultural aspects. What is the meaning of the situation for people? So it's something I'll talk about a little more as we go. But some other considerations. So we have adjustment disorders. We have obviously disaster, vicarious trauma. We have things to be careful about. Anxiety, depression, obsessive behaviors, obsessive thinking, orthorexia, which is a term that's relatively new to me, but it tends to focus on healthy eating, possible suicidal thinking. That's rare, but I have come across it in my life and then in my practice. And of course, co-occurring things that are unrelated to eco-anxiety directly, but might be related to the person's functioning, like ADHD or substance abuse. And of course, we have our own culture, risk factors, presence of social supports. There's a lot to think about when you're thinking about someone's functioning. So I hope this is landing for you all. I don't see anything in the chat, but I'm assuming we're going along pretty well. So you'll see some guidelines for climate distress and anxiety. One came out of a program that was partly sponsored by the University of Washington, which is helpful, this Medicine for a Changing Planet. I recommend that set of guidelines. And they'll have some general approaches, which are common sense approaches, psychological triggers, social supports, what are signs of eco-anxiety, right? And then what we want to do is add to these approaches what we understand and kind of enrich them with more ideas and things. So for example, yes, we have these basic ideas about anxiety, but we can step back and start to use what we know again about what's the world that this person is living in and what have they experienced, and coming out of just the intrapsychic inside the person. What are their moderators? What are their sources of vulnerability? What are their mediators? What do they think about? What's their culture? What's their education? Where do they live? What is the literal weather like there? So it's an invitation. I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but this is a teachable moment to really learn about ourselves as people with all these issues. So let's think about some case examples to make this more real. So these are composite case examples. They're not they're based on real people, but not specifically real people. And the photos are not of real people. They're hypothetical photos. A young person, Agnes character. Agnes to me stands for the really precocious, cynical, really smart young person who's really active in climate or environmental issues. They might be involved in the Sunrise Movement, for example, or one of these kinds of groups. When you're 22, you're an elder in the Sunrise Movement, right? So it's a young people. And, someone like Agnes would say, well, my previous therapist didn't know what a Keeling curve was. And so they didn't get it, Keeling curve is, as you might know, is just the famous curve about the climate change, CO2 rising in the atmosphere. She would use terms like youth washing, where young people are put up at meetings to sort of symbolically say the leaders care about kids, but then they'd be whisked aside so the power players can make their decisions. So really, really being aware of tokenized as a young person in this work, and talked about her group meeting with the governor of Oregon, and the governor didn't listen to all of their policy proposals that they carefully created, but just spent the whole meeting as a photo op talking about policy. So she felt like the governor was gov-splaining them, right? So, cynical, Agnes, make a deal with me. Like, let's stick with this a little bit. I think there are ways that I can help. So let's just try it out. It's an experiment. One of my sayings with therapy in general and with climate is validate, elevate, create. Validate the person's concerns, elevate them, and get creative about them. So when someone brings in a climate concern, yes, it's important. It has value. Let's talk about it. Not only that, let's elevate it. Let's make it the most important thing we're going to talk about right now. And let's get creative about this. Do we need to get more information? Do we need to pull in someone else that can help us? Do we need to moderate? Are you getting a little worked up here? I mean, it's a nice day right now. Can we calm down and be in the present moment? Sometimes these are difficult issues where we just have to meditate on them, right? So that's a way to kind of get started with this. And I like the creative piece because it smuggles in some positive emotionality early on, because most people are coming in with a real narrow kind of alarmed sense about these things. So we want to kind of elevate, validate, elevate, create, and create some of that energy. We might talk about the Keeling curve. Let's talk about that. It is not it's not a waste of a session to talk about climate science with a client if they're interested in that, because that's what they're interested in. And what does that mean? And where did you learn about this? And do you want to learn more about this science? And how do we measure these things? It's fascinating. It's really interesting. And it's also scary. A big part with someone like Agnes is, you don't have to solve climate change in order to cope with it. In fact, it's not solvable. It's a wicked problem. It's a bunch of issues wrapped together. So you can cope in the short term while you're working on it. That can be really an epiphany for people, because on a concrete level, they feel like if I can't solve this problem, then I'm not allowed to cope. So it's just something to think about. Delphina, another character, she stands for the grad student, veterinary student, This person's from Chicago area, big Greek, like she says, a big fat Greek family, studying chemicals in the Great Lakes, PFAS chemicals, which are these kind of chemicals that never break down. So once you create them, they just stay in the environment forever, and they accumulate and they get in our bodies, they get in animals, and it's really terrible. So she's sitting with all this information. She has really high standards, as you know, to get in veterinary school, to be a veterinary doctor, super hard to do. So she's high standards, guilty, perfectionistic, aware of her own impacts, feeling depressed, dealing with summer sad. That's something that I've experienced. It's a paradoxical kind of, seasonal pattern of depression in the summer, which is exacerbated now these days because of heat and climate issues. So she's dealing with stuff like that, sleep problems. And of course, she's also thinking about her family and her future and family expectations to have children. And she doesn't think she wants to have children. So you're getting into all this kind of life development questions, right? So for Delphina, we hurt where we care. You have values. That's why you're hurting. So that's an important insight for this work. People are concerned about climate and environment because they have deep values that are being threatened, right? And so when we remind them of their values, then we're moving toward health and identity, because our values are pretty solid and we can actually base ourselves on our values. So getting into the positive aspects of ourselves. And despair is fatigue in disguise, right? Some of this is just being tired, being burned out. It's common sense stuff, right? This is not rocket science, but it's important to recognize what we know already about health and well-being in this area, right? I can take the healthiest person, the most well-adjusted person, and put them in 2 or 3 years of working on climate or environmental issues, and they're gonna get tired and they're gonna get burned out, right? So something to keep in mind. So bringing the focus to self-care, and then this idea we have issues that I touched on earlier. This is kind of a level 2 concept, but it's important. This brings in more of a psychodynamic, psychoanalytic perspective here. It's never just one thing. We have the capital I issues we want to work on in the world, our values. I want to fight poverty, injustice. I want to support democracy. I want to, stand up for an oppressed group of people. I want to work on animal rights, etc. These are all important capital I issues that will come into play in this area. You all have your versions of this. And you have your lowercase I issues, which is your own stuff, your own personality, your own background, your own vulnerabilities, your own neuroses, your own imposter syndromes, right? Your own private dilemmas. And those are both at play. So what I like about this idea of ecotherapy is that we can talk about both. We can talk about the big issues, and let's not lose track of the small I issues. And, with someone like Delphina, they can be open to thinking about that. And again, the healthiest, most well-adjusted person will develop lowercase I issues over time. And sometimes people will be more sensitive to issues in the world because they've experienced them, obviously, and they'll want to kind of help with issues and kind of, channel their own health growth in helping other people. And then we also want to be careful about being unconscious and being obsessive about things and not necessarily having the insight and losing track of the issues that we have. I'm hearing a little sound, but let me know if there's any issues there. But we want to kind of have that insight about, okay, how am I balancing this stuff? All right. Keeping going here. I'll share one more case. Roman, he's an example of a scientist that is really out in the world seeing things that we don't normally see. A person that was able to go to Antarctica and see glaciers and understand some of the real dangers of some of the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet and how that'll affect sea level rise. And it is really mind-blowing stuff to wrap your head around. And when people come back from these trips, they feel really out of place and isolated because people don't understand what's going on. So that's another risk factor. Someone who's gone, studied in Greenland or in Central America in the rainforest, or has been out at the Pacific. I worked with someone years ago who was a research diver that dove in the Pacific plastic garbage patch and had that experience, and then has to live in the suburbs where people, just throw plastic around, and it can be really, that waking up syndrome can be really jarring. So having a growth mindset, this is super important here. Most people come into environmental concerns with a fixed mindset. This is the way it is. We can't change. Humans are doomed. We're limited. We have all these biases. But no, we can change, and we have the ability. The very fact that we understand so much about climate change points to the fact that we can grow and change. So there's a lot of positive stuff going on. Most news we hear about climate and environmental stuff is negative. About 90, I think the statistics I've seen is only about 3% of news we hear about climate is positive. So mostly we just hear negative stuff day in, day out. Yes, there is problems, but it's not 97-3. There's a lot of positive stuff out there. And once you start working on things, you realize, hey, there's all kinds of solutions and people are working on things. But we don't necessarily see that. So we get kind of a really negative view. And so we have to kind of counteract that. Talking about emotions is another big piece of this work, climate emotions. With someone like Roman, I would say, well, actually, let's imagine for yourself this. I'm going to lead you through a little bit of an exercise, and then we'll be wrapping up and moving more toward questions. But if you want, where you are, you can close your eyes for a moment, just take a breath, and we'll do a very mini little feelings visualization here. So this is challenge by choice. You can just listen and watch, but if you want, take a moment and close your eyes, and I'll close my eyes to do this with you. So I'm going to close my eyes, take a breath, just be here wherever you are in the meeting room or in your own space. Just take a breath. Here we are in the present moment. Imagine asking yourself, what am I feeling about all of this? The stuff that Thomas is talking about here. What am I feeling? What do I tend to feel about climate and environmental issues? What are some feelings, words that might come up? Just whatever comes up in your mind, a feeling that will come up, a dominant feeling. See if you get any feeling word signals. Now I'm going to ask you a second question. What do you want to be feeling about this? What feelings would you like to have? What feelings would you like to grow, cultivate? Often people will struggle with this question. Well, I don't know. I'd like to feel a certain thing, but I don't know if I can. Just be open. What would you like to feel? It could be a stretch feeling. It might seem far away. But what would you like to feel? Give yourself permission just to name it. If you can't feel that, you might feel some middle ground feeling, like just being aware or being curious, being present, being vulnerable. Then the third question is, where is the energy? Where is the place to be with your feelings? What should you be feeling? Where's the growth? Is there a feeling you need to sit with and be with, even though it's difficult? Or maybe the growth is taking in those stretch feelings. Maybe that's where the energy is. So it's kind of the wisdom question. So thank you for playing along. If you close your eyes, but you can come on back. So yeah, so we can start to think about, emotional intelligence with this work, right? Let's see, we have about 5 minutes, and I'm going to move toward some questions. Another classic case is a postpartum mom, Larissa, who's dealing with eco-anxiety and doom scrolling on her phone. this is based on a character that was in a New York Times story that I worked with, and you know, that's a classic issue. Postpartum mom is already concerned about their kids as it is, just naturally, and can have heightened issues around disasters and things like that. So there's some classic therapy that we can use here. So the last little bit, I'll give you a little window into some therapy, and then we're going to move into talking. The classic cognitive triad from cognitive therapy, right? Larissa, it was helpful for Larissa to think about, oh, okay, so I have negative views about the world. I'm thinking about the future, and then I feel bad about myself. I'm not doing enough. I'm not being a good enough mom, right? And that's going to lead me to feel depressed. That's going to bring that depression in. And so, can we work on one of these areas to see about, well, is the world going to be as bad as we think? Where can I be in the present moment and walk outside and just see that the world is okay right now? Can I think about positive things for the future for my children, right? So there are ways to start working therapeutically with this work. Another example is ACT therapy. I'm focusing mainly on kind of cognitive therapies right now. ACT therapy, which some of you may be familiar with, acceptance and commitment therapy. There's a symbol in ACT therapy, this choice point. So from this therapeutic perspective, it's all about sort of going toward my values, kind of being in the present moment, unhooking, from my automatic thinking, being in the present moment, being mindful, and then opening up to my emotional experience and going toward my values, doing what matters to me. It's a basic and very healthy kind of trans-theoretical way of thinking about therapy. But this maps, like a lot of therapy, maps directly onto climate and environmental concerns, right? Because what often happens is that we have choice points, like we're confronted with a news story or some problem in the environment, and then we're unreflective. We doom scroll. We get caught up in our feelings of anxiety or despair or avoidance. We're not sure about our values. We haven't thought through, the climate elephant and where we fit into this. And so we're going to be hooked, and we're going to be unconnected with ourselves, with our values, with our sense of our best self. So how do we go towards our values? By being in the present moment, opening up to our feelings, building emotional intelligence, clarifying our values and our commitments. And then how do we bring ourselves back to that day in, day out? So that's kind of the therapeutic place here. I never can get to all of my slides in a talk. Let me just see here, a couple more, and then we'll move towards some questions. But one of the things I'm working toward with someone like Larissa is the ability to say, I know. I already know. You see a news story. I mean, I talk to a lot of reporters, and reporters have a job. They have to keep pumping out news, and I get all these news feeds about climate and mental health, and it's interesting to see how I'll see a story, like a paper will be published, and you'll see it proliferate all over news feeds all around the world, right? But not much of climate news is new. There's only a few things that are new, right? So can we get to the point where we say, I know, I already know. I know about these problems. I've been reading about it. I've been educating myself, and it's actually worse. It's worse than you think if you really get into this stuff. The Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, it's worse than you think, right? The potential for a lot of these problems is worse than we are used to. But it's also better. There's many things going on that once you take action, you start to learn about all these solutions. So things are both worse and better than you think, right? And I haven't figured it all out. I might never, but I'm trying. I'm being mindful, my mindset, my feelings. I'm living to my values. I'm making action, right? I'm figuring out what to do with action. Just because I care about climate change doesn't mean it's my fault. And I could use design thinking. I can create prototypes for action and act and improve and keep going. So this is kind of existentially where to go. It doesn't mean it's easy, but we're not just living a Groundhog Day every day where we're rediscovering this over and over again. I'm going to stop there, and I might come back to some slides if it's useful, but I want to make sure that we have some time for questions or dialogue. And I can talk about this forever, so I could easily jump back into some slides, but I wanted to make sure we had some time. So let me know if there's a way to answer anything.
Hi, Thomas. It's Molly Groh. Thank you so much for
Hi,
this.
Molly. Nice to see you there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this great talk and really kind of opening up our thinking about so many of these dimensions. And I think for those of us in pediatrics, we don't get to dig into the psychological aspects of the work that we're doing in this as often. And it's really helpful to think about this broader framework and perspective. So thank you for bringing this to us today. And my question is about, as a general pediatrician, one of the things that I think a lot about is what are we doing on the prevention side? And I know that you're working a lot with clients and thinking a lot about people who are experiencing some of the distress and some of the effects of the climate issues and concerns psychologically. And I'm wondering what your perspectives are on some of the opportunities that we have for prevention as we think about the developmental framework that you shared a little bit about with childhood and children as they move into becoming teenagers who may have the grand awakening about what's happening, more broadly in the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's this concept in therapy around development called crossing paths, where a young person's issues will activate issues in their parent and their elders. So I think part of it is it's easier for us as parents and educators or leaders to help with young people if we've been able to sit with some of these feelings ourselves and learn to have some equanimity and have our own sense of calmness. Then we can meet the child's energy in a more receptive way without being kind of triggered and activated. So that's one way to think about this. But I'm gonna come back and just show you a slide that I was going to show anyway. So you should see a comprehensive view of climate and eco and climate therapy. This is just, I'm working on a manuscript now that's about coping on climate. And so just a lot on this next slide, but this is like a comprehensive view, which has ways to think about prevention, right? So when I'm thinking about the broad process here, we're talking about coping, much that I talked about today, that first box, the coping box, how to think, how to feel, your own personal climate report. That's some basic stuff that helps people. What happens is people come in with distress, anxiety, concern, right? And then if I give them coping skills, that's really helpful. So a lot of this is basic life coping skills, right? So that we would already be doing. What's special about this work is it gets us in, we can get on our environmental identity. So I think one of the most important things we can do with young people is say, you have an environmental identity. You didn't know this. We don't talk about this a lot in society, but you have a sense of yourself in relation to nature and the natural world. You are actually a part of nature. We are animals as part of a natural system. We don't think of it that way. You have your own values. You have places that you love. You have relationships with animals and trees, and we have an environmental identity in our family, and we are making a way in the world with our own values and identity, and that's super, super helpful. Once you share an environmental identity with someone, they have it for the rest of their life, just like their gender identity, their cultural identity. So it's really a piece of strength. And then there are ways to be well. There are ways to flourish. We can get outdoors. We can do things. We can take action. We can have healthy relationships. A big part of our environmental identity is in arts, creativity, spirituality. So there's a lot of aspects of our life regarding nature and the natural world and climate that are quite positive. I mean, they're under stress. They're being threatened, but we don't, we hurt where we care. So thinking about positive rituals, positive things in the world, and just opening up and keeping the idea of flourishing as a possibility. There's almost this idea that we cannot be happy anymore because of all this stuff. And we have to kind of respect that the reality of that, but also push against that, because it is possible to be happy. And again, if you can't do this as an adult, it's going to be hard to help a young person do it. So you have to kind of figure this out a little bit in your own way. And then we can take action. I call them at that section environmental responsibility, because it might not be action. Sometimes we don't have the ability to act yet. So we want to find our unique style. So with young people in particular, it's like, where do you fit in? You're unique. So you might just need to think about this for a while before you find an action. If you just jump into action without coping skills, identity, well-being, it's a recipe for more distress, actually. So, we want to find our unique style, educate ourselves, and try to take action as best we can. And once we do that, I find that a lot of the eco distress has gone down, because what people really need is the other stuff. Now, there's going to be a small group of people that are still really gripped with eco distress, because it's really what they're doing is difficult. But even then, the preventive side is these other things: coping, identity, well-being, and then taking action in a responsible way. So that, I hope, snuck in more slides there and answered your question a little bit. But again, it's not what we typically think, but that identity piece, environmental identity, I think is where I would go. And I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. There's a comment from online. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll read it out for everyone. From Amy Trowbridge. I appreciated the emotional awareness exercise. I'm doing some anti-racist parenting group therapy, and that exercise is very similar to what we've been doing. It's cool to see the parallels of these two intertwined elements. Really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's ecological. When you pull on one thing, it's hitched everything else. And a lot of the problems with the climate elephant is we have all these parallel silos that sometimes don't communicate with each other. But yes, that emotional intelligence piece is really important.
Wanted to bring things back to action items locally. I know we have our climate change team, and I was just wondering if you want to have the microphone for a second to talk about how those of us who are listening who live in Seattle and Washington and work here can get involved. Not to put you on the spot. Thanks.
Well, happy equinox, everyone, today, or solstice. Sorry, solstice. Solstice is early today, so it's June 20th, and our committee is really working together to think about the ways that we in healthcare can work on our commitments to addressing climate change, to be fully, engaged in the work, as Thomas is describing the opportunities that we have to come together and really collaborate on big challenges. We're thinking about the dimensions broadly in the clinical advocacy, research, and education domains. And all of this has been really coming out of the wonderful leadership from our pediatric residents who really got us launched in efforts within our residency program to work on. Some of them are here today, or were here earlier, to work on climate change issues. And Dr. Leslie Walker Harding, our chair, gave us funding to have a standing committee, and it's been really wonderful to engage together. So we welcome everyone to join us. We're meeting monthly. I'm going to actually give another update to our department meeting this afternoon about our committee work thus far, and hope everyone feels inspired by the talk. We are sponsoring a grand rounds every year, and Dr. Doherty was the first one to kick us off with that series. And I think we know there are so many different dimensions to this work, and we want everyone to feel, that there are a lot of opportunities for us to make a difference in pediatrics and thinking about the health of our and children in the future, and that we have a real responsibility to step up and think about how we change, how we adapt, and all of our kind of collective ways in healthcare that we can engage. So please join us. And thanks to everyone who has been part of it, and thanks to McKenna Parness, who recommended Dr. Doherty as a speaker today. And we've been able to bring in a lot of collaboration across our systems, including from the Department of Psychology and Psychiatry that that McKenna is part of, the Department of Anesthesiology and the Department of Radiology have all been also participating in our committee. And we've been partnering with the sustainability efforts at here at Seattle Children's with Srini Pendikatla and with the UW sustainability effort. So we have a lot of collective movement that we get to join as part of our work.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. Dr. Doherty, we really appreciate your time this morning. We learned so much and we have so much more to learn. So thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Dr. Doherty for being here, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.